Jim Jones was born on May 13th, 1931, in the small rural town of Crete, Indiana. His early life was marked by hardship and a sense of alienation, shaping a man who would later captivate thousands with his charisma and promise of a utopian society. His father, James Thurman Jones, was a disabled World War I veteran who struggled with alcoholism, while his mother, Lynetta Putnam, was a stern, independent woman with a fascination for the supernatural and unorthodox beliefs. This household, marred by poverty and instability, provided little warmth or affection for young Jim, leaving him to seek solace and meaning in the world around him. From a young age, Jones exhibited an intense curiosity about religion and the power it held over people. He was particularly drawn to the fiery sermons of the local Pentecostal preachers, where he witnessed the emotional fervor and the sense of community that such gatherings could evoke. But even as a child, Jones wasn't merely a passive observer. He began experimenting with his own form of religious expression, organizing mock church services with his playmates where he would preach passionately, imitating the style of the revivalists he admired. Jones' interest in religion was not purely spiritual, it was deeply entwined with his desire for social change. Growing up during the Great Depression, he was acutely aware of the economic and racial inequalities that plagued society. He saw religion as a tool to address these injustices, but also as a means to exert control over others. This duality between a genuine desire to help the downtrodden and a burgeoning thirst for power would become a defining feature of his life. By the time he was a teenager, Jones was already immersing himself in the study of influential leaders and ideologies. He was particularly fascinated by figures like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong, leaders who wielded immense power and demanded absolute loyalty. This interest in authoritarianism coexisted uneasily with his espousal of socialist ideals, but it underscored a key aspect of his personality: his belief in the need for strong, centralized leadership, preferably his own. After graduating from high school, Jones briefly attended Indiana University, where he continued to hone his oratory skills and expand his understanding of political ideologies. It was during this time that he began to seriously contemplate a career in the ministry, seeing it as the perfect platform to blend his religious, social, and political ambitions. In 1952, he began working as a student pastor at a Methodist church in Somerset, Indiana, where his charismatic sermons quickly drew a following. However, Jones grew frustrated with the church's reluctance to embrace racial integration, an issue that was becoming increasingly important to him. In 1954, disillusioned with the mainstream church and eager to pursue his vision of a more just and equal society, Jones founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis. The church started modestly, but it was immediately clear that Jones was not interested in simply leading a traditional congregation. He envisioned the People's Temple as a vehicle for radical social change, a place where people of all races and backgrounds could come together to build a better world. Under his leadership, the temple became known for its commitment to racial integration, social justice, and helping the poor and disenfranchised. But even in these early days, the darker side of Jones' personality was evident. His sermons, though filled with messages of hope and equality, also contained hints of the paranoia and megalomania that would later consume him. He demanded unwavering loyalty from his followers and was quick to ostracize or punish those who questioned his authority. This blend of compassion and coercion, idealism and control, set the stage for the tragic events that would later unfold in Jonestown. In summary, Jim Jones' early life was a crucible in which his complex and contradictory personality was forged. His upbringing in rural Indiana, combined with his early exposure to religion and social activism, set him on a path that would ultimately lead to the creation of the People's Temple. From the beginning, Jones was driven by a desire to effect social change, but his methods rooted in manipulation and control would have devastating consequences. The origins of Jim Jones are a stark reminder of how charisma and a noble cause can be twisted into something dark and dangerous. The People's Temple was officially founded in 1955 by Jim Jones in Indianapolis, Indiana. What began as a small congregation quickly evolved into a movement that would appeal to society's most marginalized members, offering them a sense of community, purpose, and hope for a better future. In the early days, the People's Temple positioned itself as a progressive church committed to social justice and racial integration values that were revolutionary in a time when segregation was still the norm in much of the United States. Jones, with his fiery sermons and passionate advocacy for the oppressed, attracted a diverse group of followers. His message resonated particularly with African Americans who found in the People's Temple a rare sanctuary where they were welcomed as equals. Jones' commitment to racial integration was not just lip service. He made it a central tenet of the church, ensuring that his congregation was a true reflection of the diverse communities he aimed to uplift. He often cited the teachings of Jesus Christ to justify his socialist ideals, preaching that love for one's neighbor should transcend racial and economic boundaries. The People's Temple wasn't just a place for worship, it became a social hub where members could receive food, shelter, and medical care. Jones capitalized on his followers' trust, encouraging them to donate their time, money, and even their personal belongings to the church. He promoted the idea of apostolic socialism, where the wealth and resources of the community were shared equally among all members. This appealed to the poor and disenfranchised, who saw the temple as a beacon of hope in an otherwise indifferent society. However, as the temple grew in influence, so did Jones' ambitions. By the late 1960s, he began to feel that Indianapolis was too small a stage for his grand vision. The political and social climate of California, with its burgeoning civil rights movement and progressive politics, seemed like fertile ground for the expansion of the People's Temple. In 1965, Jones made the decision to relocate the church to Redwood Valley, California, a move that would mark the beginning of the temple's rapid growth. The relocation to California brought about significant changes. The church's membership swelled as Jones established new branches in major cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. In these urban centers, the People's Temple continued to attract those who were disillusioned with mainstream society: people of color, the poor, the elderly, and those struggling with addiction or mental illness. Jones' sermons, which were broadcast over the radio, drew even more followers, captivated by his promises of equality, justice, and a utopian society where everyone could live in harmony. In California, the People's Temple's public image was overwhelmingly positive. Jones was seen as a champion of civil rights, often collaborating with local politicians and activists. His church was praised for its humanitarian efforts, such as providing free meals to the hungry, running drug rehabilitation programs, and offering housing to the homeless. The temple's progressive stance on issues like racial integration and social welfare earned it widespread acclaim, and Jones was even appointed to the San Francisco Housing Authority, further cementing his influence. But beneath this veneer of benevolence, Jones was consolidating his power in increasingly authoritarian ways. He demanded absolute loyalty from his followers, who were often subjected to public humiliations, beatings, and financial exploitation if they dared to question his authority. Jones also manipulated his followers through fear, convincing them that enemies, be they the US government, the media, or other religious groups, were constantly plotting against the temple. This paranoia, coupled with Jones' growing megalomania, began to transform the People's Temple from a church into a cult. As the People's Temple continued to expand, Jones' control over his followers tightened. Members were encouraged to sever ties with their families, surrender their assets to the church, and devote themselves entirely to the temple's mission. Jones' rhetoric grew more radical, and his sermons increasingly focused on themes of martyrdom, revolution, and the impending apocalypse. Despite these alarming developments, the temple's public image remained largely untarnished, thanks to Jones' skillful manipulation of the media and his close ties with influential political figures. In summary, the formation of the People's Temple was a complex process driven by Jim Jones' charismatic leadership and his ability to tap into the social anxieties of the time. What began as a progressive movement committed to social justice and racial equality gradually morphed into a cult of personality, where Jones' need for control and power overshadowed the church's original ideals. The temple's early appeal to the marginalized and its success in California laid the groundwork for what would ultimately become one of the most infamous tragedies in modern history. Jim Jones' ascent in political and social influence, especially in California, marked a significant phase in his life and the history of the People's Temple. Upon relocating to California, Jones quickly understood the power dynamics of the region and strategically positioned himself to become a major player in local politics. His ability to connect with the marginalized and promise them hope made him an attractive ally for many politicians and activists who saw the potential in his grassroots influence. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Jones began aligning himself with key figures in the San Francisco political scene. One of his most notable associations was with George Moscone, who was running for mayor of San Francisco. Jones leveraged his growing congregation, which now included a significant number of African Americans and other minority groups, to support Moscone's campaign. The People's Temple provided crucial votes and campaign volunteers, significantly contributing to Moscone's victory. Jones' support for Moscone paid off when Moscone appointed him to the San Francisco Housing Authority in 1975. This position not only legitimized Jones as a community leader, but also gave him access to further political networks and resources. Jones was praised for his efforts to address issues like housing and racial discrimination, which resonated with the progressive agenda of the time. Moreover, Jones' influence was not limited to local politics. He cultivated relationships with high-profile activists and organizations, including the Black Panthers and other civil rights groups. His church became a meeting place for various activists, providing a platform for discussions on social justice and equality. These connections helped Jones to maintain a positive public image as a champion of the downtrodden, despite the increasingly authoritarian control he exerted over his followers. As Jones' influence expanded, so did his ambitions. He began to see himself as not just a spiritual leader, but a key figure in the broader social and political landscape. His sermons and public appearances were filled with rhetoric that blended religious fervor with calls for social revolution, appealing to those who felt disenfranchised by the mainstream political system. This blend of charisma, social activism, and political savvy allowed Jones to build a powerful base of support that extended far beyond the confines of the People's Temple. In summary, Jim Jones' rise to influence was a carefully orchestrated journey that involved leveraging his religious platform to gain political and social capital. His ability to connect with and mobilize marginalized communities made him a valuable ally to politicians and activists, helping him to secure positions of power and influence. However, this rise also marked the beginning of his transformation from a religious leader to a cult figure, setting the stage for the tragic events that would later unfold in Jonestown. As the People's Temple grew in size and influence, so too did the darkness within Jim Jones' leadership. What began as a movement rooted in social justice and equality gradually devolved into a nightmarish cult where manipulation, fear, and abuse became the tools of control. By the mid-1970s, Jones had transformed from a charismatic preacher into a paranoid tyrant, using increasingly sinister methods to maintain his grip on his followers. Jones was a master of psychological manipulation. He created an environment where his followers were completely dependent on him, both emotionally and financially. He preached that the outside world was filled with danger, and that only within the safety of the people's temple could his followers find salvation. This isolation was key to his control. By severing their connections to the outside world, Jones made it difficult for anyone to leave the temple, both physically and mentally. One of the most disturbing aspects of Jones' manipulation was his use of staged healings. During services, Jones would claim to cure terminal illnesses and perform miracles in front of his congregation. These events were carefully orchestrated, with temple members posing as sick individuals who would miraculously recover at Jones' command. These fake healings bolstered Jones' reputation as a powerful and divine leader, further binding his followers to him through their belief in his supposed supernatural abilities. However, the devotion Jones inspired was not just through his charisma, it was enforced through fear and coercion. He demanded absolute loyalty and submission from his followers, often testing their obedience through cruel and humiliating loyalty tests. For example, Jones would wake his followers in the middle of the night, force them to drink what they believed to be poison, only to reveal afterward that it was a test of their faith. This constant state of fear and unpredictability kept his followers in a state of psychological terror, unsure of what might happen next. Financial exploitation was another tool Jones used to control his followers. He encouraged and, in many cases, pressured his followers to donate all their money and possessions to the People's Temple, promising that in return they would be cared for within the commune. This not only enriched Jones but also made it nearly impossible for members to leave, as they had surrendered everything they owned to the temple. Those who resisted or expressed doubts were often subjected to public shaming, physical beatings, or worse. Sexual exploitation was a particularly dark aspect of Jones' reign. Despite preaching against sexual immorality, Jones engaged in numerous sexual relationships with both male and female members of the temple. He used these encounters to assert dominance, often justifying his actions as a means of spiritually enlightening his followers or proving their loyalty. These relationships were rarely consensual in the truest sense, as the immense power imbalance between Jones and his followers left them little room to refuse. Physical punishment was another method Jones employed to maintain control. Those who questioned his authority or attempted to leave the temple were often subjected to brutal beatings. Jones established a system where public confessions were demanded, and those who confessed to perceived wrongdoings were physically punished in front of the congregation. This not only served as a deterrent to others, but also reinforced Jones' absolute power within the group. By the late 1970s, the People's Temple had become less of a religious movement and more of a totalitarian regime, with Jones at its helm. His leadership was marked by paranoia, delusions of grandeur, and a complete disregard for the well-being of his followers. The utopian ideals that had initially drawn people to the temple had been replaced by a culture of fear, manipulation, and abuse, setting the stage for the tragic events that would soon follow in Jonestown. This dark turn in Jones' leadership highlights the terrifying potential for abuse when charismatic individuals are given unchecked power. The story of the People's Temple is a stark reminder of the dangers of blind loyalty and the devastating consequences of a leader's descent into madness. By the mid 1970s, Jim Jones was a man under siege both literally and figuratively. The public image of the People's Temple as a progressive, humanitarian organization was beginning to unravel as former members and concerned relatives began to speak out about the abuse, manipulation, and coercion taking place behind closed doors. Us authorities, spurred by these reports, started to investigate Jones and his church, and the media began to take a closer look at the man who had once been lauded as a champion of civil rights. This growing scrutiny exacerbated Jones' already intense paranoia, leading him to make a drastic decision. The People's Temple needed to leave the United States. Jones portrayed this move as a necessary step to escape the oppression and persecution of the US government. He convinced his followers that they were under constant threat from a society that was fundamentally corrupt, racist, and hostile to their mission. In his increasingly delusional mind, the only solution was to establish a new, self sufficient community far away from the influence of American authorities, a place where they could live out their socialist ideals without interference. This idea took root in the minds of his followers who had come to trust Jones implicitly and believed in his vision of a utopian society. Guyana, a small English speaking country on the northern coast of South America, seemed to Jones like the perfect location for this new society. It was remote, isolated from the Western world, and had a government that was sympathetic to socialist ideas. Jones was able to negotiate a lease for over 3,800 acres of land in the dense jungle, a site he dubbed Jonestown. To his followers, he presented Jonestown as a paradise in the making, a place where they could finally realize their dream of living in a truly egalitarian society, free from the evils of capitalism and racism. The allure of creating a socialist paradise in the jungle was a powerful draw for many members of the People's Temple. For those who were disillusioned with life in the United States, Jonestown offered a fresh start, a place where they could be part of something larger than themselves. Jones promised that in Guyana they would build a self sustaining community where everyone would contribute according to their abilities and receive according to their needs. The move was framed as a revolutionary act, a bold step towards building the world they had always dreamed of. However, the decision to relocate was driven by more than just ideology. Jones was acutely aware of the growing legal and public relations troubles facing the People's Temple in the US. Several members had defected from the church, bringing with them stories of abuse and mistreatment. Lawsuits were being filed, and investigative journalists were digging deeper into Jones' activities. By moving the temple to a remote location, Jones hoped to escape the reach of us authorities and the prying eyes of the media. In Jonestown, he could exert even greater control over his followers, isolated from any external influence that might challenge his authority. The reality of Jonestown, however, would be far from the utopia that Jones promised. The land they had leased was remote and undeveloped, with poor soil and limited access to fresh water. The task of building a self sufficient community from scratch in such harsh conditions was daunting, and it quickly became clear that Jones' promises of paradise were little more than fantasy. But by the time many of his followers realized this, they were already trapped both physically in the jungle of Guyana and psychologically by their loyalty to Jones. In the end, the decision to relocate to Guyana was not just about escaping persecution, it was about consolidating power. In Jonestown, Jones could control every aspect of his followers' lives, far from the reach of the US government and the media. It was a move that would ultimately lead to tragedy, as the isolation and control that Jones sought would become the very tools of destruction for the People's Temple. This decision, driven by a mix of paranoia, ideology, and the desire for control, set the stage for the horrific events that would unfold in Jonestown. It was a tragic chapter in the history of the People's Temple, revealing the dangers of blind faith and the catastrophic consequences of a leader's unchecked power. When Jim Jones led his followers deep into the Guyanese jungle to establish Jonestown, he promised them a utopia, a paradise where they could live free from the oppression and corruption of the outside world. However, the reality of Jonestown was far removed from the idyllic vision that Jones had sold to his followers. The establishment of Jonestown was marked by severe logistical challenges, harsh living conditions, and a growing sense of dread as the gap between promise and reality widened. The initial construction of Jonestown began in 1974 when a small group of People's Temple members arrived in Guyana to start clearing the land. The site, located in a remote part of the jungle near the Venezuelan border, was difficult to access and had poor soil quality, making agriculture a significant challenge from the start. The nearest water source was miles away, and all supplies, building materials, food, medicine had to be shipped in from the capital, Georgetown, over rough and often impassable roads. These logistical difficulties slowed progress, and by 1977, when Jones Jones and the bulk of his followers arrived, Jonestown was far from the paradise he had promised. Upon arrival, the new residents of Jonestown were met with overcrowded and substandard living conditions. The settlement, designed to house about 200 people, was now expected to accommodate over 900. Small wooden cabins, hastily constructed and often incomplete, were packed with bunk beds to maximize space. Privacy was non existent, and the heat and humidity of the jungle made the already cramped conditions unbearable. Insects and disease were rampant, adding to the misery of daily life. Food shortages quickly became a major issue in Jonestown. The agricultural project that was supposed to sustain the community was a failure. The soil was too poor to grow enough crops, and the few that did grow were often ravaged by pests or simply didn't produce enough yield to feed everyone. The residents were put on strict rations, often surviving on little more than rice and beans. Malnutrition became widespread, contributing to the declining health and morale of the community. Yet, Jones continued to preach the myth of Jonestown as a self sufficient utopia, insisting that any hardships were temporary and would soon be overcome. As the settlement struggled, Jones' control over daily life in Jonestown intensified. His voice, amplified through loudspeakers that played his sermons and commands day and night, became an inescapable presence. He dictated every aspect of life in Jonestown, from the work schedules to the food distribution to the interactions between members. Jones also introduced a system of harsh punishments for those who defied his authority or expressed a desire to leave. Infractions were met with public humiliation, beatings, or forced isolation in a small, cramped box known as the box. These tactics further solidified his control over his increasingly desperate and isolated followers. The daily life of Jonestown residents was a far cry from the communal harmony and abundance that Jones had promised. Instead, it was a grueling existence marked by long hours of labor, inadequate food, and the constant fear of punishment. The jungle that was supposed to be their sanctuary became a prison, with the thick rainforest serving as a natural barrier that kept them trapped in Jones' control. Escape was nearly impossible, both physically and mentally, as Jones had effectively severed their ties to the outside world. The establishment of Jonestown was a grim testament to the power of manipulation and the dangers of unchecked authority. What was meant to be a paradise became a dystopian nightmare where the promise of a better life was overshadowed by the harsh realities of survival in the jungle and the oppressive control of a leader descending into madness. The once hopeful members of the People's Temple found themselves in a situation that was increasingly desperate, with no way out and no hope for the future, a tragic precursor to the horrific events that would soon unfold. Daily life in Jonestown was a far cry from the idyllic commune that Jim Jones had promised his followers. Instead of the paradise they had envisioned, the residents found themselves trapped in a harsh, oppressive environment where every aspect of their lives was controlled by Jones' increasingly paranoid and delusional directives. Jonestown, which was supposed to be a sanctuary from the evils of the outside world, quickly became a prison, a place where fear, deprivation, and constant surveillance ruled the day. From dawn until dusk, the residents of Jonestown were subjected to grueling forced labor. Jones had promised that the agricultural project in the Guyanese jungle would make the community self-sufficient, but the reality was much bleaker. The poor soil and harsh conditions made farming nearly impossible, yet Jones insisted that the community could thrive if only everyone worked harder. Residents, including the elderly and children, were forced to toil in the fields for up to 11 hours a day, often in sweltering heat and without adequate food or water. This exhausting routine took a heavy toll on the physical and mental health of the community. Adding to the oppressive atmosphere was the constant presence of Jones' voice, broadcast over loudspeakers throughout the compound. These loudspeakers played his sermons, commands, and often rambling monologues day and night, creating an inescapable atmosphere of psychological pressure. Jones used these broadcasts not only to reinforce his authority, but also to instill fear, repeatedly warning his followers of the dangers lurking outside Jonestown, real or imagined. The messages ranged from apocalyptic predictions to personal attacks on those who dared to question his leadership, leaving the residents in a constant state of anxiety and confusion. Surveillance in Jonestown was pervasive. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter of the settlement, ensuring that no one could leave without Jones' permission. These guards, often handpicked by Jones for their loyalty, were not only there to prevent escape, but also to enforce Jones' rules within the community. They monitored the residents closely, reporting any signs of dissent or disobedience directly to Jones. This atmosphere of constant surveillance created a culture of fear where even the slightest infraction could lead to severe punishment. Jones' paranoia grew with each passing day, and this was reflected in the increasingly bizarre and punitive measures he imposed on his followers. One of the most extreme forms of control was the White Knight drills, simulated mass suicide rehearsals that Jones used to test the loyalty of his followers. During these drills, residents were awakened in the middle of the night and ordered to drink what they were told was poison, only to be informed afterward that it was a test. These exercises were designed to break down the psychological resistance of the followers, making them more susceptible to Jones' influence and preparing them for the ultimate act of obedience. The psychological toll of life in Jonestown was devastating. Many residents were cut off from their families and friends, isolated not only by the physical remoteness of the jungle, but also by the emotional manipulation that Jones employed. He encouraged his followers to inform on one another, fostering an environment of mistrust and betrayal. The constant stress, coupled with the harsh living conditions and lack of adequate nutrition, led to widespread depression, anxiety, and a sense of hopelessness among the residents. For many, the dream of a utopian community had turned into a waking nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. In essence, Jonestown was a place where hope was systematically crushed by the oppressive weight of Jim Jones' control. What was meant to be a haven from the world's injustices became a place of suffering and despair. The psychological and physical pressures of life in Jonestown wore down its residents, stripping them of their autonomy and leaving them at the mercy of a leader who was spiraling deeper into madness. This dark reality set the stage for the tragic events that would soon bring Jonestown to its catastrophic end. As the late 1970s approached, the situation in Jonestown grew increasingly tense and ominous. What had begun as a utopian experiment was rapidly descending into chaos, driven largely by Jim Jones' escalating paranoia and deteriorating mental state. The seeds of tragedy were sown in the fear and distrust that Jones cultivated among his followers, as well as the growing scrutiny from the outside world, which Jones perceived as a direct threat to his control over the People's Temple. Jones' mental health had been steadily declining, exacerbated by his heavy drug use and the isolation of Jonestown. He became increasingly obsessed with the idea that enemies were closing in on him and his followers. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded, as former members and concerned relatives had begun to raise alarm about the conditions in Jonestown. Stories of abuse, manipulation, and forced labor had reached us authorities, leading to growing concern and calls for investigation. One of the most disturbing manifestations of Jones' paranoia were the White Knight drills rehearsals for what he termed revolutionary suicide. These drills were designed to test the loyalty of his followers and prepare them for the ultimate sacrifice should the need arise. During these events, Jones would wake the entire community in the middle of the night, gather them in the central pavilion, and tell them that the time had come to choose death over surrender. He would then distribute cups of liquid, claiming it was poison, and instruct his followers to drink. After a tense period, he would reveal that the poison was fake and the exercise was merely a test of their commitment. These drills left the residents of Jonestown in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the real thing might occur. Jones also conducted increasingly bizarre loyalty tests where followers were forced to endure humiliations and physical punishment to prove their devotion. He would pit members against each other, fostering an environment of suspicion and fear. Any dissent was quickly and brutally suppressed, with beatings, public shaming, and isolation. Jones' behavior grew more erratic and his sermons became darker, filled with apocalyptic rhetoric and threats of impending doom. The tension in Jonestown was further heightened by a custody battle that drew significant media attention and intensified Jones' fear of external threats. The case involved a young boy named John Victor Stone, whose parents were members of the People's Temple. After defecting from the group, the parents sought to regain custody of their son, who remained in Jonestown under Jones' control. Jones claimed that the boy was his biological son and refused to relinquish custody, leading to a legal battle that attracted the attention of us authorities and the media. This case became a flashpoint, symbolizing the broader conflict between Jones and those who sought to expose the truth about Jonestown. The growing concerns among relatives and former members eventually caught the attention of us Congressman Leo Ryan, who decided to visit Jonestown to investigate the allegations firsthand. Ryan's decision to travel to Guyana, accompanied by a delegation that included journalists and concerned relatives, marked the beginning of the end for Jonestown. Jones, already paranoid and unstable, viewed the visit as an existential threat to his authority. He feared that Ryan's investigation would lead to the dismantling of the People's Temple and the exposure of his lies and abuses. As the delegation arrived in Jonestown in November 1978, the atmosphere was tense. Although Jones and his followers initially tried to present a facade of normalcy, the cracks quickly began to show. Several residents slipped notes to members of Ryan's delegation, pleading for help to escape. When a small group of followers expressed their desire to leave with the congressman, Jones' paranoia reached a fever pitch. The stage was set for the tragic events that would soon unfold, a tragic culmination of the escalating fear, control, and desperation that had come to define life in Jonestown. In summary, the build up to the Jonestown Massacre was marked by a toxic mix of paranoia, control, and external pressures. Jones' increasing delusions, coupled with the growing awareness of the abuses within the People's Temple, created an environment ripe for tragedy. The loyalty tests, rehearsals for mass suicide, and the custody battle all contributed to a climate of fear and tension, ultimately leading to the horrific events of November 18, 1978. The visit of us Congressman Leo Ryan to Jonestown in November 1978 marked a pivotal moment in the tragic saga of the People's Temple. Ryan, known for his hands-on approach and willingness to investigate issues personally, decided to visit the remote settlement in Guyana after receiving alarming reports of abuse, human rights violations, and members being held against their will. His visit, intended to shed light on the conditions in Jonestown, would ultimately trigger a chain of events that led to one of the most horrific mass suicides in history. Congressman Ryan arrived in Guyana on November 15, 1978, accompanied by a delegation that included journalists, concerned relatives of People's Temple members, and aides. The group made their way to the Jonestown settlement on November 17th, where they were initially greeted with warmth and hospitality by Jim Jones and his followers. Jones, aware of the scrutiny he was under, went to great lengths to present Jonestown as a thriving, harmonious community. The members of the delegation were treated to a carefully orchestrated welcome, complete with a communal dinner, singing, and performances meant to convey the joy and unity of the People's Temple. During this initial visit, Ryan and his group were shown only the positive aspects of Jonestown. The communal buildings were clean and well maintained, and the residents appeared content and enthusiastic. Jones, though clearly under strain, spoke to the visitors, assuring them that the reports of abuse were baseless and that everyone in Jonestown was there by choice. For a moment, it seemed that the visit might pass without incident. However, the facade began to crack as some Jonestown residents saw the visit as their last chance to escape. That evening, during the festivities, a few members discreetly handed notes to the journalists and members of Ryan's delegation, begging for help to leave Jonestown. These notes confirmed the worst fears of those who had accompanied Ryan, that people were indeed being held against their will and were desperate to escape. The next day, as Ryan prepared to leave, a small group of Jonestown residents approached him and asked to leave with him. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Ryan agreed to take them, knowing full well the risk it posed. The tension in the air was palpable as the defectors boarded a truck with Ryan's group, heading towards the nearby airstrip at Port Kaitama, where planes awaited to take them back to Georgetown. As the truck prepared to depart, the situation took a chilling turn. A temple member attempted to attack Ryan with a knife, but the attack was thwarted. This incident signaled the unraveling of the situation. Fearing what might come next, Ryan decided to accompany the defectors to the airstrip to ensure their safe departure. Upon arriving at the airstrip, Ryan's group began boarding the planes, but before they could take off, a tractor carrying armed Jonestown guards arrived. In a coordinated attack, the guards opened fire on the group, killing Congressman Ryan, NBC reporter Don Harris, NBC cameraman Bob Brown, San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, and Temple defector Patricia Parks. Several others were wounded in the ambush, narrowly escaping with their lives. This brutal attack marked the point of no return for Jonestown. Back at the settlement, Jim Jones, now fully convinced that the end was near, called his followers together and enacted the final tragic act of the People's Temple, the mass suicide that would claim the lives of over 900 people. The congressional visit, intended to bring justice and transparency, instead served as the catalyst for one of the most devastating events of the 20th century. Congressman Ryan's bravery in confronting the horrors of Jonestown cost him his life, but his actions also brought to light the true extent of the nightmare that Jim Jones had created. The chilling turn of events that followed his visit remains a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the tragic consequences of blind devotion. The events at the Port Kaitama airstrip on November 18, 1978 were a tragic and pivotal moment in the Jonestown saga, marking the point of no return for Jim Jones and his followers. What began as a tense but controlled evacuation of defectors quickly descended into chaos and violence, culminating in a brutal attack that claimed the lives of us Congressman Leo Ryan, several members of his delegation, and People's Temple defectors. This act of violence irrevocably sealed the fate of the Jonestown community. After a harrowing visit to Jonestown, where Congressman Ryan had witnessed both the carefully curated facade of harmony and the underlying desperation of those wanting to escape, he and his delegation, along with a group of defectors, made their way to the nearby Port Kaitama airstrip. The atmosphere was charged with anxiety as the defectors, who had just risked everything to leave, boarded the planes that would take them back to Georgetown and safety. Ryan, committed to ensuring their safe departure, remained on the ground to oversee the boarding process. As the group prepared to leave, a tractor towing a trailer approached the airstrip. On board were armed members of the People's Temple who had been dispatched by Jones to prevent the departure of the defectors. Without warning, the gunmen opened fire on the assembled group, unleashing a hail of bullets that turned the airstrip into a scene of carnage. Congressman Ryan was among the first to be shot, falling to the ground as the gunmen continued their assault. In the chaos that followed, NBC reporter Don Harris, NBC cameraman Bob Brown, San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, and Temple defector Patricia Parks were also killed. The gunmen showed no mercy, targeting anyone in sight, including those already wounded and helpless on the ground. The survivors, some of whom played dead to avoid further gunfire, were left traumatized by the sudden and brutal attack. The psychological impact of the attack was immediate and devastating, both for those at the airstrip and for the followers back in Jonestown. For Jim Jones, the ambush represented the ultimate act of defiance against the outside world, a final, desperate attempt to maintain control over his crumbling empire. but the act also signified the collapse of any remaining semblance of order within Jonestown. Jones, already spiraling into paranoia and despair, now believed that the US government would retaliate with full force, bringing destruction to the community he had built. Back in Jonestown, the news of the attack spread quickly. Jones, convinced that there was no way out, gathered his followers in the central pavilion and announced that the time had come for revolutionary suicide. This decision, born out of a mix of fear, control, and Jones' delusional thinking, would lead to the deaths of over 900 people, including hundreds of children. The attack on the airstrip was not just a tragic loss of life, it was the catalyst that unleashed the final catastrophic events in Jonestown. It revealed the lengths to which Jones was willing to go to preserve his power and control, and it underscored the dangerous consequences of blind obedience to a charismatic but increasingly unhinged leader. The violence at Port Kaituma marked the beginning of the end for Jonestown, setting the stage for one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The massacre at Jonestown on November 18, 1978, remains one of the most harrowing and tragic events in modern history, not only because of the sheer number of lives lost, but also because of the circumstances under which they were taken. The final death toll was staggering. 918 people perished in the jungle of Guyana, including over 300 children, in what was both a mass murder and a mass suicide orchestrated by Jim Jones. As the horrific events unfolded, the full scale of the tragedy only became apparent in the aftermath. When Guyanese authorities arrived at the Jonestown site, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies were strewn across the compound, lying side by side in neat rows, many still clutching the cups of cyanide-laced flavor aid that had been used in the mass poisoning. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the sight of so many lifeless bodies, including those of innocent children, left the authorities and later the world shocked and appalled. The discovery of the bodies took place over several days, with the death toll rising as more victims were found hidden beneath others or in remote parts of the compound. The sheer number of deceased overwhelmed the local authorities, who had neither the resources nor the experience to deal with such a large-scale disaster. The process of identifying and cataloging the dead was slow and grueling, further compounding the grief and horror experienced by those involved. The loss of life at Jonestown sent shockwaves around the globe. News of the massacre spread quickly, and the world watched in disbelief as the details of the event emerged. The fact that so many children had been killed, most of them too young to understand the choice that had been made for them, struck a particularly painful chord. The images of Jonestown with bodies stacked in rows and the makeshift nursery where infants had been poisoned first became indelible symbols of the tragedy. The international response was swift and intense. Governments, media outlets, and the public grappled with the scale of the disaster, struggling to comprehend how such an atrocity could have occurred. In the United States, the massacre led to a wave of introspection about the nature of cults, the dangers of charismatic leaders, and the vulnerabilities of those who are drawn into such movements. There were calls for greater oversight and regulation of religious and communal groups, as well as renewed efforts to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. The Jonestown Massacre also prompted a broader conversation about the psychological and social factors that can lead to such tragedies. Scholars, psychologists, and sociologists studied the events leading up to the massacre, trying to understand how a group of ordinary people could be driven to participate in their own destruction. The concept of brainwashing and the power of groupthink became central to these discussions, as did the role of fear, isolation, and manipulation in breaking down individual resistance. In the years that followed, Jonestown became a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the capacity for human beings to commit horrific acts under the influence of a charismatic leader. The memory of the massacre continues to haunt the collective consciousness, serving as a stark reminder of the dark potential that exists within the human psyche when power is abused and faith is twisted into fanaticism. In the end, the death toll at Jonestown was not just a number, it was a measure of the profound loss and suffering experienced by hundreds of families, the anguish of a community that had placed its trust in a man who betrayed them in the most tragic way possible, and the deep impact on a world that watched in horror as the events unfolded. The legacy of Jonestown is one of sorrow, reflection, and a commitment to never forget the lives that were lost in the name of a twisted vision of paradise. In the immediate aftermath of the Jonestown Massacre, the world was left in shock, grappling with the scale and horror of the event. The investigation into what happened in Jonestown was a massive and complex undertaking involving multiple agencies, media outlets, and the testimonies of survivors. The US government, particularly the FBI, launched a full-scale investigation to understand how such a tragedy could occur and to determine the extent of criminal activities within the People's Temple. The FBI's investigation, known as Operation Jonestown, uncovered a trove of evidence, including tapes of Jones' sermons, personal documents, and the so-called death tape, which recorded the final moments of the massacre. These materials provided crucial insights into Jones' psyche, his manipulation tactics, and the environment of fear and control he cultivated within Jonestown. The FBI also worked to identify the bodies and notify next of kin, a heartbreaking task given the scale of the tragedy. The media played a significant role in shaping the public's understanding of Jonestown. As details emerged, the massacre dominated headlines worldwide, with journalists uncovering more about Jim Jones' history, the People's Temple's operations, and the lead up to the horrific event. The coverage was intense and often sensationalized, focusing on the bizarre and macabre aspects of the story, which further fed the public's fascination with the cult and its downfall. The psychological effects on survivors and the relatives of the deceased were profound and lasting. Many survivors struggled with guilt, depression, and PTSD, haunted by the memories of what they had witnessed and the loved ones they had lost. The relatives of those who died also faced immense grief and the challenge of understanding how their family members had become entrapped in such a destructive cult. For many, the trauma was compounded by the stigma associated with having been involved with the People's Temple, leading to isolation and difficulties in processing their grief. Public perception of cults was irrevocably altered by Jonestown. The massacre highlighted the dangers of charismatic leaders and the psychological manipulation that can occur within closed, isolated communities. It also led to greater scrutiny of religious and communal groups, with calls for increased regulation and oversight to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Jonestown became a cautionary tale about the potential for human vulnerability to be exploited in the name of ideology or religion, a legacy that continues to influence discussions about cults and extremist groups today. Amidst the overwhelming tragedy of Jonestown, a few managed to survive the massacre, escaping both physically and psychologically from the horrors of that day. Their stories provide a harrowing and deeply personal perspective on the events that unfolded, shedding light on the strength and resilience required to survive such an ordeal. For some, survival came by sheer luck or quick thinking. A small number of Jonestown residents were able to escape into the dense jungle as the mass suicide began, hiding until they were certain they were safe from Jones' enforcers. These individuals faced not only the immediate dangers of the jungle, but also the psychological terror of leaving behind family and friends who were still in Jonestown, many of whom would not survive. One of the most poignant survivor stories is that of Odell Rhodes, who managed to slip away during the chaos of the final hours. Rhodes later described the surreal and terrifying experience of walking through Jonestown as the poison took effect, witnessing people he had known for years lying dead or dying. His testimony, along with those of other survivors, was crucial in helping the world understand the true nature of the horror that occurred. The survivors faced a long and difficult road to recovery. Many struggled with severe trauma, grappling with the memories of the massacre and the loss of their community. The psychological scars were deep, with survivors often battling guilt for having lived while so many others perished. For some, the process of healing involved speaking out about their experiences, ensuring that the lessons of Jonestown would not be forgotten. Others sought to rebuild their lives in private, away from the public eye, attempting to find some semblance of normalcy after the devastation. The legacy of Jonestown is one of deep sorrow and profound lessons. The events of November 18, 1978 left an indelible mark on history, becoming a symbol of the dangers of religious extremism, psychological manipulation, and the cult of personality. The phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, though often used flippantly, originated from this tragedy and serves as a grim reminder of the power of brainwashing and mass delusion. In the years since the massacre, Jonestown has been studied extensively by psychologists, sociologists, and historians seeking to understand how such a tragedy could happen. The event has become a case study in the dynamics of cults, exploring how charismatic leaders like Jim Jones can exploit the vulnerabilities of individuals and draw them into a closed, insular world where reality is distorted and dissent is crushed. Jonestown also influenced how future cults and extremist groups are perceived and monitored. The massacre led to increased awareness of the warning signs of cult behavior, such as isolation, authoritarian leadership, and the use of fear and coercion to maintain control. These lessons have been applied in efforts to prevent similar tragedies, though the challenge of balancing religious freedom with the need to protect vulnerable individuals remains a complex issue. In popular culture, Jonestown has been referenced and depicted in various films, documentaries, books, and television shows, often as a symbol of ultimate tragedy and the perils of blind faith. These portrayals continue to evoke strong reactions as the story of Jonestown taps into deep fears about the potential for manipulation and control in any society. Ultimately, the legacy of Jonestown is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the catastrophic consequences that can arise when power is abused and when individuals surrender their autonomy to a single, unchallenged leader. It underscores the importance of vigilance, critical thinking, and the need to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them for their gain. Jonestown is a story that, though deeply tragic, has left a lasting impact on the world, shaping how we understand and respond to the dark side of human nature.